story we have all been told, the one about the first people to set foot in the Americas, seems to be settled history, a vast land bridge stretching from icy Siberia. Hardy bands of hunters, stone-tipped spears in hand, patiently tracking herds of colossal mammoths into a new and untouched world. It is a good story, it is neat, and it is simple. But history is rarely so simple. What if the first chapter in this great human epic has been torn from the book? What if the first footsteps to mark this continent did not come from the west across that land bridge, but instead came from the east, across a forgotten ocean of ice? Welcome to the Bedtime Historian. Tonight, settle in and join us on a journey deep into the past to a lost age. We will search for the clues of a forgotten people and an expedition so extraordinary that it was erased from history.
Our story begins in a world you would not recognize. A world sculpted by ice and time. To understand the first chapter of humanity's great American epic, we must first travel back, deep into the grasp of the last great ice age. Imagine a planet, colder, drier, and far more immense. A world where much of the Earth's water was not in the oceans, but was locked away in colossal sheets of ice, miles thick, that covered vast portions of the northern hemisphere. The sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today, and because of this, lands that are now drowned beneath the waves were then exposed to the sky. Coastlines were redrawn, and continents were connected in ways that now seem impossible. It was in this lost world that one of the greatest landmasses in planetary history existed. A continent that is now but a memory in the geologic record. We call it Beringia. It was not a bridge, not in the narrow sense we might imagine. It was a subcontinent, a sprawling expanse of land nearly 1,000 miles wide, connecting what is now Siberia in Asia with modern-day Alaska in North America. Today, this land is buried beneath the cold waters of the Bering Strait and the Chukchi Sea, but then it was a vast open country. Do not picture a landscape of uniform white snow. Beringia was a world of cold, but it was also a world of life. It was a steppe tundra, a dry, windswept plain covered not in dense forests, but in tough grasses, sedges, and low-lying shrubs. It was a world of subtle colors, of gray-green mosses, and pale lichens clinging to ancient rock. The air was thin and bitingly cold, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant ice. The sun, even in summer, hung low in the sky, casting long, stark shadows across the plains. For most of the year, the ground was frozen solid, a hard, unyielding floor beneath an endless sky, and across this immense landscape roamed giants. This was the domain of the Pleistocene megafauna, creatures of a scale that strains the modern imagination. Herds of woolly mammoths, like moving mountains of shaggy brown hair, carved paths through the lowlands, their long curved tusks sweeping aside snow in search of frozen grass. Great herds of steppe bison, with massive humps and horns that spanned 6 feet, grazed on the open plains, their breath pluming in the frigid air. There were horses, not the elegant creatures we know, but a smaller, hardier, wilder breed. There were giant ground sloths, slow-moving behemoths that could stand taller than an elephant, and camels adapted to the bitter cold. And where there are grazers, there are always hunters. Alongside the great herbivores stalked some of the most formidable predators the world has ever known. The giant short-faced bear, a creature that could look a man in the eye even when standing on all fours, was the undisputed king of this domain. Scimitar-toothed cats, cousins to the famous saber-tooth, hunted in packs, their serrated fangs built for shearing flesh. And everywhere there was the constant presence of the great dire wolves, larger and more powerfully built than any wolf. alive today. This was the world that humanity first entered. A world of immense danger and immense opportunity. Into this world stepped a new kind of hunter. They were not the strongest, nor the fastest, but they were the most adaptable creatures to have ever walked the earth. They were modern humans, Homo sapiens, physically identical to us in every way. They arrived in Beringer, not as conquerors, but as survivors. They were people who had spent thousands of generations perfecting the art of living in the harshest environments on the planet. They moved in small, nomadic family groups, perhaps no more than 20 or 30 individuals, bound together by kinship and necessity. Their lives were woven into the seasons and the migrations of the great herds. They knew the subtlest signs of the changing weather, the meaning of a bird's call on the wind, the story told by a footprint in the frozen mud. Their technology was born of the world around them. From stone, they flaked razor-sharp spear points and butchering tools. From bone and ivory, they carved fine needles to sew together warm, layered clothing from the hides of the animals they hunted. Their shelters were likely simple, temporary structures made of hide and mammoth bones, easily dismantled and moved as they followed the animals that provided their existence. Their minds were as sophisticated as our own, filled with stories, beliefs, and a deep, spiritual connection to the world they inhabited. For them, the line between the physical and the spiritual was thin, and every animal, every river, every mountain held a spirit and a power. They did not have maps, no grand vision of a new continent to populate. Their journey into Beringer was not an expedition. It was a slow, generational drift, a hunt that spanned centuries. They pushed eastward simply because the animals did, following the endless plains that offered sustenance for thousands of years. Beringer was not a bridge to be crossed, but a homeland to be lived in. It was a vast, isolated sanctuary, a refuge from the crushing ice sheets to the east and west. It was here, in this lost heartland of the Ice Age, that a new people were forged. A people who would, without knowing it, stand on the threshold of an empty continent for millennia. The people of Beringer lived in this isolated heartland, but the world of ice is never static. It is a world of slow, inexorable change. As the Earth's climate began a gradual and uneven warming, the great glaciers that had held the world captive began to shift. To the east of Beringer lay the titans of the Ice Age, two ice sheets of unimaginable scale. The Laurentide Ice Sheet, a single body of ice that smothered most of Canada and the northern United States, and the Cordilleran Ice Sheet, which clung to the Rocky Mountains down to the Pacific coast. For thousands of years, these two glaciers were fused together, presenting a solid wall of ice, thousands of feet high, an impassable barrier to any southward migration. But as temperatures rose, a sliver of hope emerged. A seam between these two frozen giants began to melt. Slowly, painstakingly, a corridor of land began to open. This was the feature that would come to be known as the ice-free corridor. It was not a welcoming path. It was a long, narrow, and treacherous passage, stretching for more than 1,000 miles. At first it would have been a sterile and hostile environment, a landscape of raw gravel, melting ice walls, and raging torrents of meltwater. The wind would have howled down its length, a constant bone-chilling gale pouring off the immense walls of ice on either side. Life would have been scarce, limited to the hardiest of mosses and eventually small, scattered herds of animals brave enough to venture into the passage. The journey through this corridor would have been one of the great endurance tests in human history. It would have meant leaving the familiar plains of Beringia behind and venturing into a narrow, uncertain world between two walls of ice. For generations, families would have pushed south, their entire existence confined to this grim and barren landscape. It was a journey fueled not by a destination, but by the same ancient impulse that had carried them out of Asia. The constant, patient search for life and sustenance just beyond the horizon. And then, after an epic journey that we can scarcely comprehend, the first of them emerged. Imagine standing at the southern mouth of that corridor, your eyes adjusting after a lifetime spent in a world of muted grays and blinding white. Before you, a new world unfolds, a world of green, a world of unimaginable richness. These were the Great Plains of North America, a vast, sweeping grassland teeming with life, a hunter's paradise that had never known the presence of humanity. The air was warmer, thicker. The sun felt different. Great rivers, fed by the melting ice, flowed across the plains, and along their banks grew gallery forests of willow and poplar, and the animals were there in numbers that must have seemed miraculous. Great herds of mammoth and mastodon, steppe bison, camels, and horses covered the plains as far as the eye could see, and unlike the wary creatures of Beringia, who had been hunted by humans for thousands of years, these animals had no fear of the small, two-legged figures that now stood at the edge of their world. For the first hunters to emerge from the ice, this was a land of unbelievable abundance, a world ripe for settlement. From this moment, the story of humanity in the Americas accelerates dramatically, spreading out from the foot of the glaciers. These first peoples began to move across the continent with astonishing speed. Within just a few hundred years, a single, unified culture seemed to explode across North America. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, and south towards the Isthmus of Panama. We know this culture by the unique and deadly signature it left behind. A masterfully crafted stone spear point. We call them the Clovis people, named for the site of the first major discovery in Clovis, New Mexico, in the 1930s. The Clovis point was more than just a tool. It was a technological marvel, a lethal piece of artistry that marks one of the high points of Stone Age technology. They were often large, beautifully flaked from high-quality stone like chert or obsidian. But their defining feature, their unmistakable signature, was the flute. A flute is a channel, or groove, removed from the base of the point on one or both sides. This channel allowed the point to be hafted securely onto a wooden spear shaft, creating a devastatingly effective weapon perfectly suited for hunting the largest and most dangerous game. It was, in essence, the killer application of its time. A technology that allowed small bands of hunters to take down 40-ton mammoths. And wherever these Clovis points were found, a similar story emerged. They were found among the bones of extinct megafauna, a clear sign of their success as hunters. Archaeologists found them in stunning numbers in every corner of the continent. The story they told seemed clear, elegant, and powerful. A single group of people, the Clovis culture, had entered the continent through the ice-free corridor around 13,000 years ago. They were the first. Armed with their superior technology, they spread rapidly, their population booming in a land of plenty. They were the first Americans. For the better part of a century, this was the bedrock of American archaeology. It was known as the Clovis first model. It was a perfect picture. It answered all the major questions. Who were the first Americans? The Clovis people. Where did they come from? Siberia, through Beringia. When did they arrive? around 13,000 years ago. How did they get here? Through the ice-free corridor. It was a theory so compelling, so complete, that for decades, it became scientific dogma. Any evidence that appeared to contradict it was viewed with extreme skepticism or was dismissed outright. The book on the peopling of the Americas, it seemed, was closed. The perfect picture was complete, framed, and hung on the wall of history. But history is a restless place, and pictures, no matter how perfect they seem, can sometimes hide more than they reveal. The frame was about to break. For a long time, the picture remained hung on the wall of history, admired and undisputed. The Clovis first model was more than just a theory. It became the central organizing principle of American archaeology. It was a clear, bright line drawn in the sand of time at roughly 13,000 years ago. Any human presence found on the continent could be neatly categorized. If it was younger than the line, it fit the model. If a discovery was claimed to be older, it was, by definition, an error. The theory became a gatekeeper, and its most staunch defenders were sometimes known as the Clovis police. For decades, they guarded the timeline vigilantly, and any claim of a pre-Clovis occupation was subjected to intense and often brutal scrutiny. Many claims came and went, dismissed for sloppy excavation, unreliable dating, or for being merely natural rock formations mistaken for tools. The Clovis first model seemed unassailable. But in science, as in geology, pressure can build silently beneath a placid surface, searching for a fault line. The first major tremor, the one that would begin a series of shocks to the established order, came not from the open plains of the West, where Clovis points were abundant, but from a quiet, wooded valley in western Pennsylvania. It came from a place called the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. The site itself is unassuming. It is a large, sandstone overhang, a natural shelter carved from a cliff face by the patient work of wind and water. For millennia, this sheltered space offered protection from the elements, a reliable refuge for both animals and humans. And for archaeologists, such a place is a treasure. Over thousands of years, the floor of the shelter acted as a time capsule. As layers of sediment, dust, and human debris built up, one on top of the other, like pages in a book. To dig down through these layers, or stratigraphy, is to read that book backward, from the present into the deep past. In 1973, a young archaeologist named James Edavasio began a careful, methodical excavation at Meadowcroft. He and his team were not looking to rewrite history. They were simply conducting a thorough study of a promising site. They dug with painstaking precision, documenting the exact location of every single flake of stone, every fragment of bone. As they moved down through the upper layers, they found exactly what they expected. Evidence of human use stretching back for hundreds and then thousands of years. But then they dug deeper. They passed the layers that corresponded with the known age of the Clovis culture, and they kept finding things beneath the Clovis level. In soil that was clearly older and undisturbed, they found more evidence of human life. They found stone tools, not the large fluted points of the Clovis people, but smaller, more varied implements. They found blades, scrapers, and even a unique, finely made point, unlike anything seen before. They found ancient fire pits, the charcoal still intact, marking the exact spots where families had gathered for warmth and safety in a forgotten time. They knew they had found something significant, but the crucial question remained. How old was it? Edavasio and his team were meticulous with their dating. They collected numerous samples of charcoal from the fire pits and sent them to the world's leading radiocarbon dating laboratories. When the results came back, they were scarcely believable. The deepest, oldest layers of human occupation at Meadowcroft were not 13,000 years old. They were 16,000 years old. Some dates even pushed back as far as 19,000 years. It was archaeological heresy. These dates suggested that humans were living in Pennsylvania, thousands of miles to the east of the ice-free corridor, a full 3,000 to 6,000 years before the Clovis people were supposed to have arrived. When Adivasio published his findings, the reaction from the archaeological establishment was not one of excitement, but of immediate and fierce resistance. The defenders of the Clovis first model launched a relentless campaign to discredit the Meadowcroft site. They argued that the radiocarbon dates must be wrong, that the samples must have been contaminated. The most prominent criticism was the claim that groundwater, seeping through the rock, had carried ancient carbon from nearby coal deposits and contaminated the fire pits, making them appear far older than they actually were. It was a plausible criticism, one that needed to be addressed, and address it Adivasio did. For years, even decades, he and a host of other scientists conducted every conceivable test on the site. They analyzed the soil, the water, the plant, remains, the animal bones. They cross-referenced their radiocarbon dates with other dating methods. The conclusion, again and again, was the same. There was no contamination. The dates were correct. The evidence was solid. Humans had been at Meadowcroft deep in the Ice Age, long before the supposed opening of the ice-free corridor would have allowed them passage. Yet, for many, the Clovis dogma was too strong to be broken by a single site. Meadowcroft was largely relegated to the footnotes of textbooks, an asterisk next to the official story. It was a persistent, inconvenient truth, a crack in the foundation, that the gatekeepers tried their best to plaster over. But the crack was there, and it was about to get much, much wider. For years, the story of Meadowcroft was the story of a lonely outlier, a persistent anomaly that could, by and large, be kept at the margins of the great historical narrative. But science abhors a vacuum, and a single, stubborn fact can eventually exert a gravitational pull that reshapes an entire field of thought. While the debate over Meadowcroft simmered, another discovery was being unearthed. Thousands of miles away, in a place so far from the supposed entry point of the Americas that it would stretch the Clovis first model not just to its breaking point, but far beyond it. The discovery was made in a waterlogged peat bog at the very southern tip of the continent, in Chile. The site was called Monte Verde. If Meadowcroft was a crack in the foundation, Monte Verde was a seismic event that would bring the entire structure crashing down. The site, discovered by archaeologist Tom Dillehay, was a miracle of preservation. The oxy-poor, water-saturated ground had perfectly preserved organic materials that normally would have vanished in a matter of centuries. What Dillehay and his team found was not just a collection of stone tools, but an intimate, frozen-in-time snapshot of daily life during the Ice Age. They found the timber foundations of long tent-like huts, their wooden posts still held together with knotted reeds. They found stone hearths, surrounded by the scattered tools and animal bones of the last meal eaten there. The preservation was so astonishing that they even found a child's footprint, perfectly impressed into the soft clay near a fire pit. A tangible, haunting connection to a person who lived 14,500 years ago. They unearthed mastodon meat, still bearing the cut marks from a butcher's stone knife. They found a collection of medicinal plants, some of which had been brought from the distant Pacific coast, indicating a deep knowledge of the landscape and a complex system of trade or travel. It was a complete picture of a functioning human settlement, and the radiocarbon dates were undeniable. People were living at Monteverde, at the far end of South America, at least 1,500 years before the Clovis people appeared in North America. The timeline simply no longer made any sense. For people to have reached the southern tip of Chile by 14,500 years ago, they would have had to enter North America thousands of years before that. They would have needed time to cross the entirety of 2 continents. The journey through the ice-free corridor, which was supposedly only opening around 13,000 years ago, was now an impossible explanation. The entire narrative of the peopling of the Americas was fundamentally broken. Naturally, the resistance to Monteverde was even more intense than it had been For years, De la Haye's findings were attacked, his methods questioned, and his evidence dismissed. The battle raged in academic journals and at conferences. But unlike Meadowcroft, the evidence from Monteverde was so overwhelming, so beautifully preserved, that it could not be ignored forever. The tipping point came in 1997. In a landmark event, a group of the most prominent and fiercely skeptical archaeologists, including several of the original architects of the Clovis first model, traveled to Chile to visit the site themselves. They were given full access to the evidence. They examined the stratigraphy. They held the preserved wooden artifacts. They saw the undeniable proof of a thriving pre-Clovis settlement. At the end of their visit, they gathered and published a statement. The verdict was unanimous. Monteverde was real. The dates were valid. The Clovis barrier was broken. It was a stunning moment, the scientific equivalent of a white flag being raised over a long-defended fortress. The dogma that had ruled American archaeology for nearly a century was in an instant dead. The acceptance of Monteverde opened the floodgates. With the old restrictions gone, other pre-Clovis sites that had been dismissed were re-examined and validated. Evidence for a deep human past in the Americas began to pour in. In the Paisley Caves of Oregon, fossilized human coprolites, or dung, were found that dated to more than 14,000 years ago. At the Galt site in Texas, a treasure trove of stone tools was unearthed from layers far below the Clovis occupation. The picture was no longer of a single, rapid migration, but of a much deeper, more complex, and more ancient human story on the continent. The old picture was shattered, lying in pieces on the floor of history. But what would replace it? The death of Clovis first created a profound void, a new and tantalizing mystery. If the first Americans did not come through the ice-free corridor, how did they get here? And if they were here thousands of years earlier than we thought, who were they? The entire story needed to be rewritten from the very first page. Archaeologists began looking for new answers, new possibilities. And it was in this new, open, intellectual landscape that a radical, almost unthinkable idea, one that had been whispered at the fringes for years, could finally be brought into the light. An idea that would suggest the story of the first Americans began not on the plains of Asia, but on the frozen shores of ancient Europe. The death of the Clovis first model left American archaeology in a state of profound and exciting uncertainty. The old, linear story of a single migration through a land-based corridor was gone. In its place was a void, a deep and ancient mystery. The evidence was clear. Humans were in the Americas thousands of years before the ice-free corridor was a viable path. So, if they did not walk, how did they arrive? The most logical and widely accepted new answer was that they came by sea. archaeologists began to develop the coastal migration theory, which proposed that the first peoples were not inland big game hunters, but were maritime hunter-gatherers. This theory suggests they traveled in small boats, patiently working there, way down the Pacific coastline from Beringia. This kelp highway, rich in marine life, would have provided a reliable source of food and shelter. It is a powerful and elegant theory, and it is very likely a large part of the true story. But, as this new consensus began to form, the shadows of another, far more radical possibility started to take shape at the fringes of the science. It was an idea that required a complete reorientation of the map, a willingness to look not to the west for the origins of the first Americans, but to the east. It required a journey not along the coast of the Pacific, but across the vast, frozen expanse of the North Atlantic during the coldest depths of the Ice Age. To investigate this extraordinary claim, our story must now leave the Americas behind and travel across an ocean and back in time to a world of ice and stone in ancient Europe. Our destination is the region of modern-day France and Spain, but our time is 20,000 years ago. This was the last glacial maximum, the period when the great ice sheets reached their furthest extent. It was one of the harshest periods in human history. Much of Europe was an uninhabitable polar desert, yet here, in the small refuge of southwestern Europe, humanity not only survived, it thrived. This was the home of a remarkable and enigmatic culture, a people we now call the Solutreans, named after the rock of Solutre, a prominent archaeological site in eastern France. For too long, our popular image of Ice Age Europeans has been that of primitive, brutish cavemen. The Solutreans shatter this stereotype. They were a people of profound sophistication, technical ingenuity, and artistic sensibility. They lived in a world of profound cold, hunting vast herds of reindeer, horse, and bison that migrated across the frigid plains. To survive in such a world required a level of skill and intelligence that is difficult to comprehend. And the evidence they left behind speaks of their mastery. They were innovators. They were likely among the first to develop and use the eyed needle. It seems like a simple invention, but it was a revolution. The ability to sew with fine bone needles allowed for the creation of tailored, layered, and waterproof clothing from animal hides and furs. This was not just for comfort. It was essential survival technology, a barrier against the killing cold. They perfected the otlotl, or spear thrower, a device that effectively doubled the power and range of a hunter's arm, allowing them to hunt the great beasts of their world with greater safety and efficiency. But more than anything, the Solutreans were masters of stone. Their skill in flint knapping, the art of shaping stone tools, went far beyond mere function. It was an art form. Other cultures of the time made effective, practical tools. The Solutreans made objects of breathtaking beauty and almost impossible delicacy. Their signature creation, the pinnacle of their craft, is known as the laurel leaf point. These were large bifacial blades, shaped like a laurel leaf, that are among the most finely crafted stone artifacts ever discovered. To hold a Solutrean laurel leaf is to hold a masterpiece. They are often impossibly thin, some of them so slender and delicate that they become translucent when held up to the light. The symmetry is perfect, the edges razor sharp. The skill required to produce such an object is immense. A single misplaced strike, a moment's miscalculation of the force needed, and the entire piece would shatter after hours or even days of work. Many of these laurel leaves are so fine and fragile that archaeologists believe they could not have been used as practical spear points. They may have been ceremonial objects, status symbols, or offerings, a testament to the maker's supreme skill, a tribute to the stone itself. This was a level of craftsmanship that was unmatched anywhere in the world at that time, and would not be seen again for thousands of years after the Solutreans themselves had vanished. So here we have a portrait of a remarkable people. They were not isolated primitives, huddling in caves. They were a dynamic and intelligent culture, living on the edge of a frozen world. They were artists, inventors, and the undisputed masters of stone technology. They lived on the coasts of France and Spain, looking out at an Atlantic Ocean that was very different from the one we know today. It was an ocean filled with ice. They possessed the skills to survive in the harshest of marine environments. The question that began to form in the minds of a few bold researchers was a simple one. Were these master craftsmen and hardy survivors also the world's first great explorers? For a long time, the Solutreans remained a fascinating but distinctly European story, a brilliant chapter of the old world's deep past. The question of their potential as explorers was little more than a fringe speculation. But the collapse of the Clovis first model created the intellectual space for radical new ideas. And in that space, two archaeologists, Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian Institution and Bruce Bradley of the University of Exeter, began to piece together a theory that was both audacious and elegant. They looked at the mystery in the Americas, the sudden appearance of a sophisticated toolkit with no clear forerunner. And they looked at the mystery in Europe, a highly advanced culture of master craftsmen who simply vanished. And they asked, what if these were not two separate mysteries, but two halves of the same story? This was the birth of the modern Solutrean Hypothesis. The theory proposed that some Solutrean people already adapted to life on the frigid coasts of Ice Age Europe began to push further. They did not set out to cross an ocean. They simply expanded their hunting grounds. The North Atlantic at this time was not an empty expanse of blue water. For much of the year, it was choked with sea. Ice, a vast, semi-permanent ice shelf that extended from the coasts of Europe to the shores of North America. This was not a barren wasteland. The edge of the sea ice is one of the richest marine ecosystems on Earth. It is a world teeming with life, seals, walruses, seabirds, and fish. The hypothesis suggests that the Solutreans were not just coastal people, but were a maritime people, living in and among the sea ice, using skin boats similar to the kayaks and umiaks of modern Inuit peoples. And armed with their mastery of cold weather survival, they hunted along this ice edge. And this ice edge was, in effect, a bridge. It was a resource-rich highway that led, step by patient step, westward across the Atlantic. It would have been a slow, generational migration, not a single, heroic voyage. Families would have lived their entire lives on this frozen frontier, their world defined by the ice, the sea, and the animals they hunted. This was a compelling picture, but it was just a story without concrete evidence to connect the two continents. That evidence, Stanford and Bradley argued, had been hiding in plain sight. It was in the stone. We must recall the Clovis Point from the plains of North America. One of the greatest lingering mysteries of the Clovis culture was where their technology came from. There are no clear ancestors, no developmental stages for their flint-knapping techniques found in the archaeology of Siberia or Alaska. The complex method of creating a fluted Clovis point seems to appear in the Americas fully formed, out of nowhere, but the Solutreans provided a stunningly clear potential ancestor. The The similarities between Solutrean blades and Clovis points are remarkable. It goes far beyond a superficial resemblance in shape. It is in the manufacturing process, the very mind of the maker. Both cultures used an identical and highly unusual method called overshot flaking. This is a difficult technique where a flake is struck from the edge of a blade in such a way that it travels all the way across the face and removes a part of the opposite edge. It is a higher risk, higher reward technique that produces a thinner, more effective blade. This specific, complex technological signature is found in Solutrean toolkits and in Clovis toolkits, but it is almost completely absent from the stone tool. Traditions of Asia, this, the proponents argued, was the smoking gun. It was the equivalent of finding the same unique brushstroke in two paintings from opposite sides of the world. It suggested a shared lineage of knowledge, a direct transfer of technology from one culture to the other. The Clovis point was not a copy of a Solutrean laurel leaf. It was its descendant, a technology that had evolved and adapted over time to the different stone materials and the larger game of the American continent. Of course, this theory faced a major and obvious challenge: the gap in time. The Solutrean culture disappears from the European record around 17,000 years ago. The Clovis culture appears in America around 13,000 years ago. This leaves a gap of 4,000 to 5,000 years. For critics, this time gap was a fatal flaw. But for the theory's proponents, this was not a flaw, but a predictable feature of such a migration. The people who left the shores of Europe were no longer leaving archaeological evidence in the caves of France and Spain. They were living on a mobile, dynamic sea ice environment. For thousands of years, their archaeological record was being left on a platform that no longer exists. A platform that melted into the Atlantic Ocean at the end of the Ice Age. The fourth gap, they argue, is the time it took for these Atlantic pioneers to make the journey, and for their technology to slowly evolve into what we would eventually call Clovis. The evidence for their journey lies at the bottom of the ocean. The echoes of their homeland, however, lie scattered across the fields of North America, waiting to be recognized. An idea as grand as a transatlantic migration during the Ice Age cannot survive on technological comparisons alone. A theory needs more than just a plausible narrative. It needs tangible proof. It needs artifacts found in the ground, objects that can be held and measured, artifacts whose very existence challenges the established story. For the Solutrean hypothesis to move from the realm of speculation into the world of possibility, its proponents needed to find evidence of a Solutrean presence, or at least a Solutrean influence, on the western shores of the Atlantic. They needed to find the stones that could tell the tale. And the story of that search begins not in a carefully planned excavation, but with a chance discovery in the cold, grey waters of the Atlantic. In 1970, a scallop trawler named the Sinmar was dredging the seafloor about 60 miles off the coast of Virginia, in an area known as the Delmarva Peninsula. Their heavy nets were scraping along the bottom, more than 200 feet below the waves. When they hauled in their catch, they found something unusual tangled in the gear. It was the massive skull and tusk of a mastodon, a creature that had been extinct for more than 10,000 years. And with it, clutched in the same net, was a single, beautifully crafted stone blade. It was a bifacial point, about 8 inches long, dark and leaf-shaped, clearly of human manufacture. At the time, the discovery was noted, but its profound significance was not understood. The crew gave the point to the boat's owner, who kept it in his collection for years. The mastodon skull was eventually acquired by a museum. For decades, the two objects remained separate, a curious but disconnected footnote. It was not until the Solutrean Hypothesis began to gain serious attention that archaeologist Dennis Stanford learned of the find. He immediately recognized the blade. It was not a typical Native American artifact. Its shape, its size, and the techniques used to flake it were all highly reminiscent of the laurel leaf blades of the Solutrean culture of Europe. The location of the find was just as significant. The seafloor where the Sinmar was dredging was not always at the bottom of the ocean. During the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were low, this area was a wide, exposed coastal plain. It was the ancient coastline of Ice Age America. This is precisely where one would expect the very first explorers arriving from the sea to have made landfall. Stanford tracked down the mastodon skull and had it radiocarbon dated. The results were stunning. The mastodon had died approximately 22,700 years ago, right at the peak of the Solutrean period in Europe. While this does not directly date the stone point, the fact that they were found together in a sealed context on a now-submerged landscape is incredibly suggestive. Here was a Solutrean-style artifact found on the doorstep of America, in direct association with an animal from the right time period. A single dredged-up artifact was a tantalizing clue. But it was not enough. The theory needed evidence from a controlled, scientific excavation. That evidence would come from a site just inland from where the Sinmar made its discovery, a place called Cactus Hill, located on the Nottoway River in Virginia. There, archaeologists Joseph and Lynn McAvoy were excavating a sand dune that contained a deeply stratified record of human occupation. They found Clovis artifacts in the upper layers, as expected. But as they dug deeper, below a sterile layer of sand, they found something else. They found another, older level of human occupation. This pre-Clovis layer yielded a small but vital collection of stone tools. And these were not Clovis points. They were smaller, thicker, and somewhat less refined. But crucially, they were made using the exact same set of complex manufacturing techniques as the tools of both the Solutreans and the later Clovis people, including the telltale overshot flaking. Radiocarbon dating placed this pre-Clovis level at between 17 and 20,000 years old, a time frame that overlaps perfectly with the later stages of the Solutrean culture in Europe. Cactus Hill was a breakthrough. It provided what appeared to be the missing technological link. The tools here were not fully Solutrean, nor were they fully Clovis. They looked like something in between. A transitional toolkit. It was exactly what the Solutrean hypothesis predicted. The technology of the first European arrivals would have slowly evolved after their arrival in America, adapting to new materials and new challenges, eventually becoming the technology we recognize as Clovis. The tools at Cactus Hill were a snapshot of that evolutionary process in action. The stones were beginning to tell a story not of a technology that appeared out of nowhere, but of one that had a long, hidden history on the American continent, a history that began long before Clovis, and which pointed insistently back across the Atlantic. The discoveries at Cactus Hill and the recovery of the Sinmar Bipoint were pivotal. They provided the first tangible, datable evidence suggesting a pre-Clovis occupation of the American East Coast with a clear technological link back to Europe. But for a theory of this magnitude to be sustained, it needed more than a few isolated data points. It required a pattern. And as archaeologists began to re-examine old collections and target new sites with this new possibility in mind, a pattern did begin to emerge. More sites clustered around the ancient Chesapeake Bay area, which would have been a vast and resource river valley during the Ice Age, began to yield similar clues. At Parsons Island in Maryland, more stone tools were found that seemed to fit within that same pre-Clovis Solutrean-like technological tradition. A similar story unfolded at a site called Miles Point. Separately, none of these small collections of stone tools were enough to rewrite history, but taken together, they began to paint a picture of a consistent and widespread human presence in the region. Long before the arrival of the Clovis people, the evidence was no longer just a single, lonely voice in the wilderness. It was becoming a chorus. The stones, however, tell us more than just how they were made. They also tell us about the behaviors and beliefs of the people who made them. And here, another fascinating and highly specific link between the Solutrean and Clovis cultures emerges. This link is the ritual of catching. All across North America, archaeologists have found Clovis caches. These are deliberate burials of artifacts, typically containing a collection of exceptionally large, beautifully made Clovis points. Many of these points are far too large and perfectly crafted to have been functional tools. They are works of art, likely imbued with great social or spiritual value. Often, these caches and the tools within them are covered in red ochre, a powdered mineral pigment that has been associated with ritual and ceremony across the globe for tens of thousands of years. What is remarkable is that this same highly specific behavior is found thousands of miles away and thousands of years earlier in Solutrean France. The Solutreans also created caches of their finest oversized laurel leaf blades, and they too often covered these precious objects in red ochre before burial. This is a powerful connection. It is one thing for two separate cultures to independently invent a useful spear point. It is quite another for them to independently develop the same complex ritual behavior, creating non-functional artistic versions of those points, and then burying them together in a ceremonial offering. This shared ritual suggests a shared ideology, a common way of seeing the world and interacting with the sacred. It is a thread of belief that appears to stretch across the ocean. There is one final, more subtle clue, also found in the stone itself. It lies in the choice of raw material. Many of the oldest Clovis points found in the eastern United States are made from the absolute highest quality stone available on the continent. Materials like Flint Ridge Chert from Ohio or Onondaga Chert from New York, these materials are not found everywhere. They come from specific, localized quarries. What is puzzling is that the very first people seemed to know exactly where to find these elite materials, even though the quarries were sometimes hundreds of miles from where the finished points were, eventually found and used. This is not the typical pattern for a new population entering a landscape. Usually, the first arrivals will use whatever mediocre, local stone is available. Only after generations of exploring the new land do they discover the locations of the best quarries. The fact that Clovis people were using the best material from the very beginning suggests they already possessed a deep and intimate knowledge of the landscape and its resources the moment they arrived. The Solutrean hypothesis provides a neat explanation for this. If the first arrivals spent centuries or even millennia living on the exposed coastal plain and exploring the river systems that emptied into the Atlantic, they would have had ample time to discover the locations of these prime quarries long before they began to move deeper into the continent and create the archaeological record we now call Clovis. Thus, the story told by the stones becomes richer and more complex. It is not just in the shared technique of an overshot flake. It is in the specific artifacts dredged from the sea. It is in the transitional toolkits buried in the sands of Virginia. It is in the geographical pattern of sites emerging along the ancient coastline. It is in the shared, sacred ritual of burying their finest creations in red ochre. And it is in the expert knowledge of a new continent's hidden resources. All these threads of evidence, when woven together, create a compelling tapestry. They tell a story of a single, continuous tradition of people and knowledge, a tradition that was born in the caves of Ice Age Europe, and which left its final, indelible mark on the plains of ancient America. The stones have told their story, a story of a shared technology, of common rituals, and of a deep knowledge connecting to continents. But the greatest question remains, a question so profound it can be difficult to even contemplate. How could any group of people, armed only with stone, bone, and hide, possibly cross the vast and violent North Atlantic Ocean during the absolute peak of the last ice age? The very idea seems like a fantasy, a journey into certain death. To understand how this could have been possible, we must first erase the map of the world we know. We must erase the familiar blue expanse of the modern Atlantic and replace it with a world that no longer exists. 20,000 years ago, the North Atlantic was not an open ocean. The colossal ice sheets that smothered northern Europe and North America did not simply end at the coastline. They pushed far out to sea, creating immense permanent shelves of ice, and connecting these two great frozen landmasses was the sea ice. For much of the year, a vast semi-permanent pack of sea ice, hundreds of miles wide, filled the northern ocean. This was not a smooth, featureless plain of white. It was a dynamic, ever-shifting landscape, a world of immense, flat ice flows, some the size of islands, a world of towering pressure ridges, where flows had collided, pushing jagged walls of ice 50 feet into the air. And it was a world of open water leads, called polonias, temporary rivers of dark, cold water that snaked through the ice pack, appearing and disappearing with the tides and currents. This was the Great Ice Bridge, not a bridge of land, but a bridge of frozen water. And the key to understanding the journey is to understand that for a people adapted to it, this was not a barrier, it was a habitat, it was a highway, and it was a larder. The edge of the sea ice is, and was, one of the most biologically productive environments on the planet. This frozen frontier was teeming with life. The primary food source would have been seals. Millions of them, harp seals, ringed seals, and hooded seals all depend on the sea ice to rest, to molt, and most importantly, to give birth. For a hunter, this was an unbelievable bounty. Seals, clumsy and vulnerable on the ice, could be approached and hunted with relative ease. And a single large seal provided an incredible wealth of resources. It provided rich, high-fat meat, essential for generating body heat in the extreme cold. It provided blubber that could be rendered into oil for lamps, giving light and warmth in the long polar night. And it provided tough, waterproof hides, the single most important raw material for survival. To travel in this world of ice and water, the Solutrean pioneers would have needed a boat. Not a wooden boat, for trees were scarce, but a skin boat. We can imagine a vessel masterfully crafted, built upon a lightweight frame of driftwood or perhaps even mammoth bone, and covered in the stitched hides of many seals, made waterproof with rendered fat. This vessel would have been a technological marvel, similar to the umiaks of the later Inuit peoples. It would have been light enough for a few hunters to pull it up onto the ice, and tough and flexible enough to withstand collisions with floating ice. It was both a boat to navigate the open leads of water and a sledge to be dragged across. The vast frozen plains of the ice pack, life would have been a constant, patient hunt, moving slowly westward from one hunting ground to the next. They were not lost at sea. They were at home on the ice. In addition to seals, they would have hunted walrus and perhaps even the occasional polar bear. The sea itself would have provided fish in the open leads, and the sky would have been filled with immense flocks of seabirds. Like the great auk, a large flightless bird that nested on the ice floes. This was not a story of starvation and desperation. It was a story of abundance for those who possessed the skills to harvest it. Thus, the great journey unfolds not as a single, desperate dash across an empty ocean, but as a slow, multi-generational expansion of a maritime hunting culture. They were not sailing to a known destination. They were simply following the endless frontier of ice and life that stretched before them. Each generation would have pushed a little further west, their entire world defined by this rich, challenging, and starkly beautiful environment. They were not explorers in our sense of the word. They were pioneers, living their lives on a highway of ice, a highway that, unbeknownst to them, led all the way to a new world. What would life have been like in this world of endless ice? We must imagine a reality governed by a different set of senses. The world would have been overwhelmingly white, a landscape of infinite shades of grey and blue, where the eyes learned to pick out the subtlest of details, the dark shape of a seal resting far in the distance, the faint yellow tint of a polar bear against the snow, the deep, ominous blue of old, hard ice. The silence would have been profound, a deep, resonant, quiet, broken only by the sharp crack of shifting ice, the cry of a seabird, or the sudden, explosive breath of a whale surfacing in an open lead. The primary sense may not have been sight, but feeling, the feeling of the wind on the face, carrying the scent of open water or the deep, subdural vibration through the ice that signaled a distant pressure ridge collapsing. Their sense of time would have been different, marked not by a calendar, but by the slow, cyclical rhythm of the seasons. The long, dark winter, lit only by the moon, the stars, and the shimmering, ghostly curtains of the aurora borealis, and the brief, intense summer, when the sun would circle the horizon for 24 hours a day, a period of frantic activity and abundant hunting. Their knowledge of the world would have been passed down through generations, not in books, but in stories and songs, epic poems that contained the star charts for navigation, the detailed knowledge of animal behavior, and the spiritual laws that governed their existence. The journey would not have been without immense peril. Storms in the North Atlantic are legendary for their violence, and an ice age storm would have been a terrifying spectacle. Imagine a sky turning black, the wind shrieking across the ice, whipping up blinding blizzards. There would be no shelter. But what they could create themselves, perhaps overturning their skin boat to use as a windbreak, or rapidly building a snow house, an igloo, a technology they may well have mastered. The greatest danger would be the ice itself. A sudden shift in the pack, a storm surge breaking up a massive floe they were camped upon, could spell disaster. Plunging them into the lethally cold water. Navigation would have been a supreme challenge. How do you find your way in a landscape that is constantly moving beneath your feet? In the long winter, they would have used the stars, the unblinking pole star, as their anchor in the sky. During the day, they would have read the direction of the prevailing winds and the migration patterns of the birds and sea mammals, which follow ancient, invisible pathways across the ocean. They would have possessed a form of three-dimensional awareness that we have long since lost, an instinct for direction honed over 1,000 generations of nomadic life. We cannot know what drove them ever westward. Perhaps it was population, pressure, a new generation seeking their own hunting grounds. Perhaps it was a natural curiosity, the ancient human impulse to see what lies beyond the horizon. Or perhaps it was something more profound, a spiritual quest, following a prophecy or a shaman's dream. Whatever the reason, they continued. Generation after generation, they lived and died on the ice. Children were born into a world of white. Their first memory, the feel of a fur-lined hood and the gentle rocking of a boat in a dark waterlead. Elders would be buried on the ice, their bodies committed to the deep, their stories living on in the minds of their descendants. And then, after centuries, or perhaps millennia, on the ice bridge, a change would have occurred. A new sign would have appeared on the horizon. Not the familiar shape of a pressure ridge, but a low, dark line that did not move. It would be the first sign of land. Perhaps they would have first seen the great ice cliff of the Laurentide ice sheet, which at the time calved directly into the Atlantic, or perhaps, further south, they would have seen the dark, tree-lined coast of the exposed continental shelf. What must that moment have been like? To see solid, unmoving land after a lifetime spent on a shifting world of ice. To smell the scent of pine and damp earth, carried on the wind, after an existence filled with the clean, cold smells of salt water and snow. Their arrival would not have been a grand, triumphant landing. It would have been a quiet, cautious exploration. A single boat pulling up onto a rocky beach. A small group of hunters stepping out onto a new continent. They would have found a world of unbelievable richness, a world that was, for all intents and purposes, empty of people. The great forests teemed with deer, the rivers choked with fish. It would have been a paradise, but also a strange and alien world. After generations on the ice, they would have had to relearn the rhythms of a terrestrial life, but they were, above all else, adaptable. The same skills that allowed them to conquer the Atlantic ice would now allow them to conquer a new continent. They had arrived. The longest, most difficult, and most forgotten journey in human history was finally over. The first chapter of America's story had been written not in the dust of a land bridge, but in the salt and ice of a frozen ocean. The journey was over. A new world had been reached. The descendants of the Atlantic pioneers began their slow, deliberate conquest of a new continent, their ancient stoneworking skills evolving into the technology we now call Clovis. For a long time, the trail of evidence for this incredible story remained locked in the stones and the submerged landscapes of the continental shelf. But in recent decades, a new kind of archaeology has emerged, one that allows us to search for clues not in the earth, but within ourselves. This is the archaeology of the human genome, a tool that allows us to read the faint echoes of our deepest ancestral journeys, written in the code of our DNA. And it is here, in the microscopic world of our own biology, that another startling clue in the mystery of America's first peoples has been found. To understand this clue, we must first understand a specific part of our genetic inheritance, the mitochondrial DNA. It is a unique piece of our genome, passed down only from a mother to her children. Your mitochondrial DNA is a direct, unbroken copy of your mother's, your grandmother's, your great-grandmother's, and so on, stretching back through an immense maternal lineage into the mists of time. As this DNA is passed down through the generations, it occasionally develops tiny, harmless mutations, which then become permanent markers. By tracking these markers, geneticists can group all of humanity into major maternal lineages known as haplogroups. Think of them as the great clans of the human family tree. When scientists first began to map the mitochondrial DNA of modern Native American populations, they found a remarkably consistent story. The vast majority of indigenous peoples in both North and South America belonged to one of four major haplogroups, A, B, C, and D. And all four of these haplogroups trace their origins directly back to Asia. This genetic evidence was a stunning confirmation of the Berengian land bridge theory. It was the biological proof of an ancient migration out of Siberia. For a time, it seemed that the genetic story, like the archaeological one, was settled. But as more and more people were tested, a persistent anomaly emerged. Scientists found a fifth, much rarer, founding lineage. It was given the name Haplogroup X, and Haplogroup X was a profound mystery. While it was clearly one of America's founding maternal clans, it was a ghost in Asia. Unlike haplogroups A, B, C, and D, Haplogroup X is virtually absent from the populations of Siberia and East Asia. The question was immediate and obvious. If it did not come from Asia, where did it come from? The answer was perplexing. The highest concentrations and closest genetic relatives of haplogroup X are found thousands of miles away, in the populations of Europe and the Near East. Here was a deep and challenging puzzle. The genetic evidence seemed to be telling to contradictory stories. One story of a clear migration from Asia, and another, fainter story, a whisper of a connection back to ancient Europe. Furthermore, the highest frequency of haplogroup X in North America is found among the Algonquian-speaking peoples, such as the Ojibwe, who live around the Great Lakes region and the northern East Coast. Geographically, this is precisely the area where a people arriving across the Atlantic would have first spread and settled. For proponents of the Solutrean Hypothesis, this was a moment of stunning convergence. The genetic anomaly provided a potential biological tracer for the very migration that the stone tools suggested. The Solutrean theory provided a logical, if audacious, explanation for how a European-linked haplogroup could have become one of America's founding lineages. It was not the result of recent historic contact. It was the signature of a deep, ancient presence, a whisper in the blood of a forgotten journey across the ice. Of course, the story is not so simple, and the genetic evidence is a subject of intense debate. Mainstream geneticists propose other explanations. Perhaps there was once an ancient population in Siberia that carried haplogroup X, and their lineage simply died out in Asia after their relatives had crossed into Beringia. Others point out that the specific subclade of the haplogroup found in America, called X2A, is distinct from the main European branches, and that they may have split from a common ancestor in the Near East more than 30,000 years ago. Long before the Solutrean period, the debate is complex, and the data is far from conclusive, but the mystery remains. Haplogroup X is a stubborn, inconvenient fact. It is a genetic ghost that haunts the simple story of a single migration from Siberia. It does not prove that the Solutreans came to America, but it provides a compelling and independent line of evidence that suggests the story of the first Americans is far more complex than we once believed. It is a biological echo, a faint signal of an ancient connection that resonates powerfully with the story being told by the stones. The faint, genetic echo of haplogroup X provides a tantalizing biological clue, a possible link back to a forgotten European ancestry. But is there another, more human record of this ancient journey. If a founding population of people truly did arrive from across a frozen ocean, is it possible that some memory of that incredible event, no matter how faint or distorted, could have survived the passage of millennia? To find out, we must turn from the hard data of science to one of the oldest and most powerful forms of human record-keeping, myth. We must search for echoes of the journey not in DNA, but in the sacred oral traditions of the Native American peoples themselves. Oral traditions are not simple histories in the way we might think of them today. They are rich, complex tapestries of metaphor, spirituality, and memory, woven together to explain the origins of the world and the identity of a people. Yet, within these sacred stories, it is sometimes possible to find the faint, preserved memories of real, deep historical events. And it is among the same Algonquian-speaking peoples of the Northeast, the very tribes who carry the highest frequencies of haplogroup X, that we find myths and traditions that resonate with the idea of an ancient arrival from the East. Across the water, consider the recurring figure of the culture hero found in the traditions of many Eastern tribes. This is a powerful, benevolent being who arrives at the beginning of time, often from the East, across the great ocean. This figure, known as Glooskap to the Wabanaki peoples, and by other names to other tribes, is not a creator god in the sense of making the world from nothing. Instead, he arrives in a world that already exists and makes it habitable for humans. He teaches people the essential skills for survival, how to hunt, how to build shelters, how to live in society. He brings them their technology and their spiritual knowledge. In some traditions, this figure is described as being like or bearded. While these are myths, not historical accounts, the parallels to the Solutrean Hypothesis are striking. The Solutrean pioneers were culture heroes in a very real sense. They would have arrived from the East, across the Atlantic Ocean, and they brought with them a new and highly advanced technology, the stoneworking knowledge that would eventually become the Clovis toolkit, which allowed their descendants to thrive in the New World. It is not difficult to imagine how, over the course of 15,000 years of retelling, the memory of these real, skilled, founding ancestors could have been transformed and elevated into the myth of a single, powerful being who brought the gifts of civilization from across the sea. Other stories, when viewed through this lens, take on a new significance. The Iroquois creation story tells of a sky woman who falls from the world above onto a planet that is covered entirely by water. It is the animals who must dive deep to bring up mud to place on a turtle's back to create the first dry land. North America, an origin story that begins with a world of nothing but water, resonates powerfully with the experience of a people who had spent a lifetime in a marine environment, for whom the entire world was water and ice, until they finally reached the solid ground of a new home. We must, of course, approach these connections with great care and respect. These are sacred traditions, not simple data points to be plugged into a scientific theory. And there are many other myths that speak of origins from the earth itself, or of migrations from other directions. But the persistent echo of an arrival from the East in the stories of the very people whose genetics also hint at a connection to the East is a powerful coincidence. It is another thread in the tapestry, a cultural clue that aligns with the biological and archaeological evidence, like the whispers found in our DNA. The echoes within these ancient myths do not offer definitive proof. They offer something more subtle, a sense of resonance, a feeling of a deep underlying pattern. When viewed in isolation, a strangely shaped stone, a rare genetic marker, or an evocative myth can all be explained away as coincidence. But when all the clues are laid out, together, a new picture begins to emerge. The story told by the stones, the story told by the blood, and the story told by the myths all seem to be pointing in the same direction. They all seem to be whispering of a lost chapter in the human story, a chapter that began not in the familiar grasslands of Siberia, but in a world of ice and water, on the far side of a forgotten ocean. We have traveled a great distance together. We have journeyed from the familiar plains of Beringia to the frozen shores of Ice Age France. We have crossed a lost ocean of ice, and we have dug for clues in the soil of Virginia and in the depths of our own DNA. We began with a picture that seemed perfect, a story of the first Americans that was simple, complete, and for nearly a century accepted as truth. And then we watched as that picture began to crack, as new discoveries revealed a human story on the continent that was far deeper and far more mysterious than was ever believed. Into that mystery, we introduced a new and radical possibility: the Solutrean Hypothesis, a theory that proposes a forgotten chapter in human history, an epic of survival and exploration across the frozen Atlantic. We have examined the evidence for this audacious claim, piece by piece. We have seen the profound problems with the old timeline, the impossibility of the Clovis people being the first. We have held up the stones themselves and seen the uncanny reflection of Solutrean craftsmanship in the first American toolkits, a shared technological DNA that is difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. We have followed the trail of physical artifacts, from a single Solutrean-style blade dredged from the floor of the Atlantic, to the transitional tools found buried deep in the sands of Cactus Hill. We have seen a pattern of ancient sites emerge along the very coastline where our Atlantic pioneers would have first made landfall. We have looked beyond the tools into the minds of the makers and found a shared, sacred ritual of catching their finest creations in red ochre, a behavioral signature that connects the two cultures across a 5,000-year divide. And we have listened for the faintest echoes of this journey, finding them in the genetic anomaly of haplogroup X, and in the recurring myths of culture heroes who arrived, like the Solutreans, from the east, across the great water, taken together. These threads of evidence weave a compelling, if incomplete, tapestry. So why, after decades of research and debate, does the Solutrean hypothesis remain on the fringes of mainstream archaeology? Why is this story still not told in our history books? Part of the answer lies in the nature of science itself. Science is, and should be, a conservative institution. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary proof. And while the evidence for the Solutrean connection is tantalizing, it is not yet definitive. It is a powerful circumstantial case, but it lacks the kind of undeniable proof that is needed to overthrow a century of established thought. The critics point to very real and significant weaknesses in the theory. The most significant is the lack of human remains. As of today, no human bones have been found on the American East Coast that can be definitively dated to the pre-Clovis period and linked to a European migration. The story, so far, is told only by stones and shadows. Furthermore, the evidence for a true maritime adaptation among the Solutreans in Europe is still inferential. We assume they had skinned boats and the skills to hunt seals, but no definitive remains of a Solutrean boat have ever been found. No images of them have ever been discovered in their spectacular cave art. For many archaeologists, these missing pieces are simply too large to ignore. The journey from a maybe to a certainty is a long one, and for now, the Solutrean hypothesis has not completed that journey. The debate within science is one of evidence and interpretation, but the controversy surrounding the Solutrean hypothesis extends beyond the quiet halls of academia. It has, at times, become entangled with the complex and often painful politics of identity and heritage. The idea of a European discovery of America thousands of years before Columbus has been, unfortunately, co-opted by some groups to promote nationalist narratives, or worse, to try and diminish the status of Native Americans as the original peoples of this land. It is therefore essential to be perfectly clear about what this theory is and what it is not. The Solutrean hypothesis is not a story of a European conquest. It is not the story of a race replacing another. The scientists who advocate for this theory are not arguing that the first Americans were white or Caucasian in the modern sense of those words. Those concepts did not exist 20,000 years ago. If Solutrean pioneers did arrive on these shores, they were a small founding group, a single thread in a vast and complex tapestry. Their descendants, over the next 15,000 years, would have become indigenous to the continent. They became Native Americans. Their lineage would have undoubtedly mixed with the far more numerous waves of migration that did arrive from Asia. The story is not one of erasure, but of addition. It suggests that the heritage of the Americas is even deeper and more complex than we imagined, woven from ancient peoples who came from different directions at different times, all of them pioneers. So where does this leave us? We are left with a profound and beautiful mystery. Perhaps the ultimate truth is not a simple choice between one theory and another. Perhaps the story of the peopling of the Americas is not a single, linear narrative, but a chorus of many different stories. It is possible that people first arrived by boat down the Pacific coast from Berenja. It is also possible that people arrived by boat across the Atlantic from Europe, and it is certain that people arrived by foot across the land bridge. The continent was not populated by an event, but by a process, a long and layered story of many arrivals. We are, after all, a species of explorers. It is in our nature to see the horizon and wonder what lies beyond. Perhaps we should not be surprised to find that our ancient ancestors on all sides of the globe were just as curious and just as brave as we are. The greatest library of human history now lies at the bottom of the sea. When the great ice sheets melted, the sea levels rose by more than 400 feet, drowning the fertile coastal plains where the majority of humanity likely lived. It is on these submerged landscapes that the definitive answers to these great mysteries likely rest, waiting for a future technology to find them. Until then, we are left with the stones, the genes, and the myths. We are left with the echoes of a lost world. The story of who we are is never truly finished. It is constantly being rewritten as new discoveries challenge what we thought we knew. Perhaps the past is not a destination we can ever truly arrive at. It is a vast and quiet ocean, and all we can do is stand on the shore. Listen to the faint whispers that the waves bring to us from a distant shore and wonder. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the deep past. The whispers of history are all around us, if we only take the time to listen. If you've enjoyed this story, please consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing to the Bedtime Historian. It helps us continue to uncover these forgotten tales for you. You may also wish to click the notification bell to know when our next exploration is about to begin. Until our next story, rest well, and may your dreams be filled with the echoes of lost worlds.